Hi, I'm Gina Neff. I run the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy here at Cambridge, and it is my pleasure to introduce this next panel. As Alan noted yesterday in his opening discussion, our community is really, truly under attack. Many of our colleagues are dealing with online, legal, reputational, physical threats, and it's not entirely clear how we manage these. I think we're in an enormously privileged position here in the UK to have some of these conversations. The last 100 days have truly been shocking in terms of their attacks on science and their attacks on the work of furthering the science in online information. In fact, it's highly likely that those who seek to disrupt our work, our research, will continue to do that, and I'm placing my marker down that these fights will come to the UK as well. So for this panel, we've asked colleagues to engage in a discussion about the nature of these threats and to offer some ideas for really what we might do to mitigate and navigate this threat environment. Now, first, I would like to introduce our erstwhile moderator, Emma Briant, who is a research affiliate at the Cambridge Center for Financial Reporting and Accountability and a visiting associate professor at the University of Notre Dame's Lucy Family Institute for Data and Society. She joins Alice Marwick, who is the Director of Research for Data and Society Research Institute in New York. And she is also the founder of the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina. Beside Alice is Julia Ebner, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Calleva Center for Evolution and Human Sciences at the University of Oxford. Ask me how I know. And she also is a leader of the Lab on Violent Extremism, thank you, that wasn't in my bio, at the Center for the Study of Social Cohesion. And then we have Mutale Nkonde, who is the founder of AI for the People and is engaged in doctoral research here at the University of Cambridge in our new Department of Digital Humanities. Join me in welcoming our panel, and I turn it over to Emma.
Thank you so much, Gina. So researchers today must navigate a dynamic threat environment, one that is increasingly hostile to some of the most important work we do. Indeed, as Alan said in his opening comments yesterday, it's a testament to the power of research colleagues' work that some of them find themselves singled out for a barrage of abuse and attempts to silence them. Beyond the more specific challenges faced by researchers challenging powerful or deceptive actors, we are witnessing an increasingly hostile environment for scientific inquiry of all kinds. Attacks on the university itself, for example, are happening in the United States. Attacks that researchers are traveling on government-issued visas legally to do legitimate research or speaking in that country, feel forced to take extraordinary measures to try to protect themselves. They may even avoid the US as a place to study, research, or speak altogether. For fear of searches, harassment, detention, deportation that we're witnessing across the news at the moment, merely for exercising their right to speak and to do academic research. In contrast to the many conspiracy influencers that are crying censorship across social media to millions of followers, academics often feel unsafe and unable to speak out about threats that they may face publicly. And a lot of that tends to be because they don't particularly want to highlight the kinds of ways that they could be attacked. So they feel very often that more attacks will follow if they raise the alarm. Now, that means a lot of people end up fighting this battle alone, and we want to make sure that that doesn't happen, which is why organizing this panel was so incredibly important to me. The threats that we see are not just a feature of the US political environment, though. They are experienced already in the United Kingdom and across Europe and around the world. So I want to stress that this is an international problem. The US situation is extraordinary, but different risks are posed in different countries for researchers and their work, which gain often less attention than those going on in the United States right now. In my opening comments, I wanted to also dispel two myths. First, that researchers face risks and attacks because they were not well prepared, or somehow should have been more careful. You can be so well prepared, but threats often deliberately coming from a direction that you least expect them to come from. They can confound the best laid research plans. Secondly, threats may be complex, relentless, and lack solutions, which is why we're talking about them today, because we need to provide solutions for the many, many researchers to enable their work around the world. Much of the media focus in recent years has focused on attacks on researchers, discussing them as though they were a feature of the social media environment alone, leading many to the assumption that researchers are complaining about nasty comments on the internet, that they're being oversensitive to legitimate criticisms. What we're talking about isn't that. What we're talking about here are coordinated, multi-vector attacks from often well-funded political actors or governments. So we're going to expand on this next in our discussion, but so I'm going to hand it over to my expert panel and ask what kinds of threats are researchers and academics facing?
So researchers and academics are facing a variety of threats around the globe. So in one of my various capacities, I run a working group called the Risky Research Working Group at the Association of Internet Researchers, which is a professional association for academics studying the internet. And a few years ago, we recognized that many of the people in our community were facing these types of threats. The most common one is online harassment. That's what most people think of when they think of threats to researchers. You know, you go on Twitter, you become the main character of the day, and all of a sudden you're facing a barrage of hateful messages and horrible DMs from people around the world. But unfortunately, it goes beyond that. We're now seeing things like weaponized Freedom of Information Act requests where people's personal email is being put on the internet and combed through by various actors in order to attempt to identify some sort of malfeasance. We're seeing the use of AI to try to identify plagiarism in people's work, which can be as simple as, a misplaced citation or a couple of words that are duplicated from a source, and then the person is undergoing sort of this attack. And it can range from things like swatting and doxing to reputational harm. And so one of the things that we did is we put together a report. I don't know if we have that slide available somewhere, but we are launching this report called, it's called Risky Research, and it provides a 68-page guide for academics, first to determine whether their research may be risky, second to identify what some of the things they can do to prevent these risks from happening to them, and third to really call for institutions to protect their researchers, because these are risks that are now coming in the normal line of work for many people working on a variety of topics. And as a result, there we go. So you can download it from this QR code. Right now it isn't quite launched yet, so this is sort of the preview version. And you'll see in the document that we have sort of advice for students, for supervisors, and for people sort of across the academic spectrum.
Yeah, I think Alice gave a really brilliant overview already of the threat landscape. One of the things that I've noticed in my own research, I've now been studying radicalization and violent extremism for the last 10 years, and when I first started back in 2015, 16, 17, there were already a lot of campaigns that were targeting researchers, but also journalists and people in other professions looking at these types of phenomena, at these types of topics that were hyperpolarizing, and also in some fringe communities were seen as we were perceived as the political opponents. And even back then, there was quite a strong rise in campaigns that were targeting researchers, as Alice mentioned, trying to dox, for example, our addresses, even our home addresses, office addresses, sometimes even posting phone numbers, bank details, and so on the internet. And we've seen that now in the last few years, I think both the scale and the nature of the problem have really changed. Mm-hmm. Back in the days, I was doing some immersive investigations on the inside of trolling armies, for example, of neo-Nazi and white supremacist trolling armies that were targeting their political opponents. And they had thousands of members. At the height of their presence, they had 10,000 members, and they were coordinating behind the scenes on, for example, encrypted messaging apps like Telegram or Discord, and they were using gamification to make their harassment campaigns and their hate campaigns and disinformation campaigns a little bit more interesting for people who were just there for the fun of it, or just for basically the entertainment factor. So some of them used video gaming language, even used the structures of the gaming app Discord to, for example, if they were really successful at targeting a political enemy with what they would call sniper missions, so again, very military-like language, they would climb up in the hierarchy. And now, however, I think we're not just seeing these types of trolling armies that we saw in 2016 and 17, which actually, where there was a spillover effect from the US, the alt-right, mm-hmm. They were the first ones to run these types of campaigns to Europe and to the UK. But now we see that this is all on a much more partly institutionally backed level. We see legal threats that researchers are facing. We're still seeing the physical threat side as well, and the cyber threats. But I think it's that very multifaceted threat that is intimidating a huge number of researchers, or is targeting a huge number of researchers and trying to silence them systematically. And that is something where, again, we can look at the United States, I think, to see what is also coming to Europe, because often we see the first trends in the US, and then we see a copying effect and an intimidation effect in the UK and in Europe. So right now, looking across the Atlantic, I'm extremely worried, because what we see is that, legal threats have been hitting researchers and universities, of course, yes. on even an institutional level, as well as more strongly institution-backed disinformation, misinformation campaigns, and also smearing campaigns. Yeah. And that is then often leads to targeted hatred, and can even manifest, of course, in physical attacks if there's a strong demonization and a strong othering effect. I'll hand over to the next speaker too.
You've been quite comprehensive. The only thing that I would add are economic threats that are related to reputational risk. So in my work at AI for the People, one of the things that we do is a lot of high-level advisory work, specifically with the UN and other multinational bodies. And one of the case studies that we brought to them recently was a blogger. Her name was Shafika Hudson. She was in the United States. And in around 2014, she had identified what we're now thinking of as the manosphere and the right through the weaponization of manhood. But that actually started on 8chan and 4chan, 2014 in the US. Because she identified this, so this predates Gamergate, she, for the rest of her life, unfortunately, trigger warning, was subject to such huge harassment reputationally, she could not work. Because she could not work in our field, she was actually driven from working in other fields because some of the tactics that were described. She ultimately lost her housing, she lost her ways to support, and unfortunately passed away 2 years ago now. So when we're speaking about threats to researchers, this is part of what the UN would call offline-online continuum of harm. And it isn't just about people having your name called on the internet. Ultimately, somebody calling your names on the internet would be welcomed. This can be a risk to your actual life.
Yes, thank you so much. And I want to underscore the range of actors that are involved in this as well. There could well be, huge, wealthy internet companies funding things. There may well be, PR companies involved, intelligence firms, all sorts of different actors. There may be hackers. So all of this coming at you at once, maybe threats to your university, for instance, all of which may be received in different ways at different institutions. So that brings me, we've covered a little of this already, but I want to ask, where do threats come from, and in what ways is this a changing landscape? Alice, you could speak to a lot, I think, about the history of this.
Yeah, so I got interested in looking at online harassment in about 2013 or so when I attended a panel at South by Southwest. Like, this is definitely getting into like the sort of older internet stuff, and of feminist bloggers. And one of them said that they had a dedicated FBI agent dealing with all the death threats that they were getting. And I talked to them afterwards, and they said that there were these male supremacist groups, sort of as Mutale mentioned, that had been targeting them. And then we saw this blow up with Gamergate. So a lot of this sort of targeted networked harassment, networked incitement, as Julia said, was really sort of workshopped in these far-right groups that were building on the sort of the presuppositions of troll culture, right? And because there just were not any supports in place then, there was still this presumption that people on the internet were generally good actors. So a lot of sites like Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or whatever, they didn't have good blocking mechanisms in there. So people could really do an enormous amount of harm just by focusing on the internet. The problem is that because these tactics are so good at pushing people out of the public eye, I did a study of people who had experienced online harassment a few years ago, and almost every single person I talked to, even people who had quite high-profile professional careers, had toned down their internet presence as a result because it was so hurtful and harmful to them that they just did not want to put themselves and their families in that position anymore. And because of the ways that these tactics are leveraged, they're leveraged far more often against members of minoritized and marginalized groups. So they're pushing specific types of voices out of the public sphere. And as a result, because these tactics have been so effective, they've now been taken up by groups at all levels, from the sort of highest levels of government to still the sort of online trolls. And unfortunately, we still haven't really developed very effective ways at countering a lot of these things. And institutions still seem to act surprised every time this happens, although it's a very well-worn playbook at this point.
Yeah, I think it's also quite telling, building on what you just said about the male supremacist side of it. They're not the only ones, but it's quite telling that this is an all-female panel. There are lots of studies and surveys that show that women are disproportionately targeted by these campaigns. Women in journalism, women in research, women in politics, and in other fields. And that not just the scale of the threat is different, but also the nature of the threat. So a lot more sexualized, gender-based violence and online harassment is hitting women in different fields. So, and of course, especially then at the intersection also with for example, if you're also then from a minority background, then you get even more hatred. So there's really a disproportionate risk for women, but also for minority groups. And one of the things that I would perhaps like to say in response to the question, where is this coming from? We've seen also a complete diversification of actors, as you said, but also in ideological terms. It's not just ideologically clear groups. Sometimes they're also ideologically fluid, or what we would call salad bar extremism in the US. The FBI calls it like that. Here in the UK, they call it clear, unstable, unclear, or what is it again? MUU, mixed, unstable, and unclear. Less catchy than salad bar extremism. Yeah. But we've seen that, in particular, the male supremacist trends have surged in recent years, and there's a strong uptick also in youth radicalization into some of these fringe groups and into these circles. Here in the UK, of course, the Netflix series Adolescence has created a huge debate around this, and also in other countries we see that young boys are increasingly vulnerable and susceptible also to becoming part of some of these groups that would then target, in particular, women with these threat campaigns. But it's something where we've seen similar campaigns being staged by the QAnon conspiracy myth community, by anti-vaxxers, by kind of in general the different anti-science, whether that's lobbying groups that support those networks or just trolls, online trolls, or also white supremacist, white nationalist actors, as well as, of course, jihadist groups. So it's a really diverse landscape that we're seeing, and I think that's also important when we think about how to tackle this, because there's not one one solution for all of these types of threats. And I think we also need to look at generation-specific solutions, but we'll talk about solutions later, I guess. But,
just to add, again, in some of our work, we've been on the TikTok content I always get these names wrong, and this is being filmed. TikTok Content Moderation Advisory Council for the last 5 years in the US, but we're a global group of advisors. And when we get together for global summits, one of the things that's really interesting about these threats is that, yes, I agree, they're diverse and they're kind of diffused, but ideologically, over the last 5 years, we've been able to see how ideologically, particularly in minority communities, the same ideas are, my colleagues in the MENA region, for example, are speaking about the same type of anti-vax conversations as my colleagues in the sub-Saharan African region, or in the US region, where the Great Replacement theory is kind of really driving so much of this anti-immigrant sentiment. That can be seen in Africa, it's seen in the US, and it's networked and linked. Yeah. And we're now beginning to start to see, and this is a hypothesis, I'm doing my PhD, I haven't done the research, and my advisor is in the audience, so I am listening to you.
You are doing great.
That I am not going to make definitive statements about things I have not researched, so just for my advisor. But as we're looking at voting patterns, for example, in the US, this idea that, and Hispanic, that's basically everybody, is such a huge category. Hispanic people talking about bad immigrants. On the content advisory side, we've seen this bad immigrant dialogue in other minority communities in other parts of the world. So I think having a transnational view is something that we also need to think about.
Yes, definitely. And I want to underscore that actually attacks can also be coming from your own side, your own networks. Can turn against you. And I was also going to comment on the point about it being an all-women panel, because that, believe it or not, was not my intention. I wasn't looking for an all-women panel. But it just happens that the people who have, I would say, both experienced these attacks most harmfully, with the worst effects, and the people who have mounted the most brave and substantial responses to these threats have been women and minorities. So I think that's really important to say. So that brings me to the next question, which is, what can we do as researchers to prepare for or handle these threats? Alice?
Yeah, so I want to distinguish between the sort of general set of online harms that pretty much anyone on the internet can face and the specific set of online harms that researchers can face. Like, all of us are researchers, and we all do research on things that make us more susceptible to these kinds of harms. Julie and I both look at the far right. We have, Emma, all of us do on one level or another. But when you look at harms to researchers, I do think there is a little bit, nowadays in the United States especially, what we're seeing is less of the sort of more traditional gendered violence and more of people becoming villainous due to the topics that they study. So often what justifies online harassment and these sort of harms are these sort of folk devil narratives by which they take someone like Anthony Fauci, for example, and they turn him into a nefarious actor by reframing his actions, right? So he's not like a public servant who's, working on behalf of public health. He is, a servant of the deep state who is trying to microchip people and, enslave people in FEMA camps or whatever. And so I think those kinds of narratives can really apply to anybody. And what we're seeing with disinformation researchers in the US specifically is that by reframing disinformation research as censorship, you're able to sort of paint everybody in a field, regardless of their race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, with this very broad brush and make them all seem like people who are out to sort of suppress ideas. And that's a real problem, right? Because it means that an entire area of research is being systematically shut down, and the people who are doing it feel that they are morally justified in doing so. And they've been very effective at communicating this narrative to the public at large. So I will get these DMs on, well, I don't really use X anymore, but when I did, I would get DMs from people saying, well, why do you hate free speech? And I'm like, I don't hate free speech. Like, where did this come from? But it came from this set of really coherent narratives that are being pushed everywhere from these sort of very low-level fringe groups all the way up to the highest levels of the federal government. And it's very important that we as a community counter those narratives head on. We cannot cede ground. We need to stand up for the work that we do. We need to show a positive value to it. When you let another party frame the debate, you lose the debate before it's even started. So the biggest thing I would say we can do as a community is to actively advocate for the kind of work that we do, not to be ashamed of it, not to let those attacks change the way we present ourselves. The second thing is that wow. All right, thanks, y'all. There's two other things I want to say. The first is that in the guide that I had up before, we have a whole bunch of like basic OPSEC stuff that would be sort of good ideas for anyone to do, right? Like use two-factor auth, don't reuse your passwords. That kind of stuff takes a lot of time and energy. So if you're going to do that kind of thing, I would think about what your threat model is and focus on the things that you're most worried about rather than trying to make your security perfect, because that's impossible. But there are things that individuals can do. But like Emma said at the beginning, you can be the most privacy conscious person on earth and use like a burner phone everywhere you go and encrypt everything and still be at risk of these things. It is not your fault. This is not about responsibilizing the individual for structural problems. And that brings me to my third point, was that what can we do as academics and as research institutions? We need to protect those with more precarious employment. That means our graduate students. That means our postdocs. That means the adjuncts that we work alongside every day. That means people in our communities who are not tenured, who maybe are not on the tenure track. If you are supervising a lab, give your students the chance to opt out of research that could be traumatic. Protect them, advocate for them with your institutions, get security training for people on your team. And for God's sake, if you're a dean or you run a university, make a plan for when your researchers get harassed, because they will get harassed, and you cannot assume that it is their fault. So often I see someone get harassed online and their university just throws them to the wolves without standing up for them. This is part of our job to be public scholars, and as a result, the university should be responsible for protecting us from that part of our job.
I think that's really important. Yeah. I think what you just said, Alice, all of these points are really important, and I'm really just going to build on those and give some additional examples for solutions. But I think especially the solidarity among the researchers is highly important. And I do remember how lonely one feels when you are in the middle of such an attack. It can be horrible, and you start to believe that everyone is against you, and that. So I do think the solidarity in the research community is already a big factor there. But also related to that, I do think stress testing is really important. Stress testing on different levels. You already mentioned some of the operational security and cybersecurity levels. I do think it is important to stress test your email account, your different social media accounts. Do you have any addresses that are public? public somewhere, stress test what could happen in a potential targeted campaign that you face as a researcher. But also stress test the results of, or in general, the hopefully very rigorous research you do. I do think there are these new models, the plagiarism types of well, I guess sometimes they are coordinated campaigns to uncover plagiarism, even if it's on a micro level. But I do think it's really important to stress test our own publications to make sure we can't be exposed to this. I actually had a politically motivated plagiarism check in Austria, in my home country, coming most likely, I can't be sure, but most likely from politically motivated actors. Luckily, I did stress test my own publications before that and it was fine. They didn't find anything, but it was so stressful to be in that situation because you do feel like you could potentially, your whole credibility could be at stake. And likewise, stress testing yourself on a psychological level, I think that is perhaps the most important dimension. And for example, I'm also a senior researcher at the research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, a think tank here in the UK and in the US and Europe. And we have also, for example, established clear psychological support for anyone who might get exposed to such campaigns or who might witness such campaigns, because it can create chronic trauma. It's really important to also have the psychological resilience to deal with these types of attacks in order to be able to be confident that we can continue even the trickier research that we do and take the risk that we perhaps need to take in some instances. Yeah, and I think finally, the final point would be about defending the defenders. Right now we see attacks, systematic attacks in the US on law firms, people who might actually be able to support researchers who come under attack or research institutions who come under attack, as well as NGOs and, for example, NGOs that have helped researchers or people who have come under attack. So it's a targeted attack that is also not just hitting researchers, but the entire community around them that can protect them and defend them. And I think defending the defenders is perhaps a really important step. Again, at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, there are some initiatives that my colleagues have already started in that field. But I think that's increasingly important in the years to come.
The only thing I would add is decide when to use strategic silence and when to speak out. And it's really case to case. But I know in my own personal work, when I came under attack, it was actually my silence that saved me. And this might be controversial, certainly in this room, but ideas like pre-bunking and don't always work. I'm sorry, be mad at me, come and see me afterwards. But certainly that doesn't always work. But what does work is knowing people that have strategic power that are going to stand in the gap. And I know that everything from reassuring funders to don't want to say coming to Cambridge was a strategy, but certainly coming and studying this more at a place like Cambridge created a lot of space. And those were incredibly effective because it took the air out of arguments. Julie and I and Emma were speaking last night. We have other researchers in our community where, because of the level of the attack, this is a federal attack, they had to speak out, and they had to reclaim the narrative very quickly. But understanding that speaking can be as powerful as not speaking, and having a cavalry that stands behind you and beside you is extremely powerful. And make sure you have a lot of women in that cavalry, because the people that saved me were women that could have lost everything and chose not to, and collectively we won. And so I think having that collective view is really powerful too.
Yes, and I want to underscore that that also is about our relative power as researchers, right? If you have a tenured position at a university, you have 50,000 followers on social media, you have a large established network of senior professors that you're in a much stronger position to speak out, right? A lot of the time, these attacks are, being experienced by people at the very start of their careers. And, people are making those choices about whether even to try to have a big profile. And that's actually a really important thing. We want researchers to feel confident communicating publicly, right, to the public, getting their research out there. But they, those networks can be a superpower, for launching your career to counter these disinformation narratives. But they can also make you vulnerable, right? Reaching out to people in my own networks, to say, I'm under attack, by email, when I was, earlier in my career, was terrifying. Private emails, because I was thinking, oh my, they could be, FOIA'd, and then they will know who my really important, trusted mentors are. And the fact that you can feel not even able at that point where you're under attack to reach out to your friends, to the most important, powerful people that you know, because of that threat profile, is really an added layer of terror to this whole experience for new researchers who may not be able to summon quite so much support. So I want to finish with one more question. So what about the policymakers, governments, tech companies, universities we've touched on, NGOs, all of the kinds of people in this room and who will be maybe watching this after the event? What can they do? What are they doing? What should they be doing to actually support us?
I can go first just because
Yes,
I'm going to be
please do.
quick. I see we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Don't pile on.
Yeah.
Just that. You can ask me about it later. Just don't pile on.
Yeah, I might not be as quick, but it's, I would say, I think one of the main areas where I see a lot of potential in the future is actually risk assessments on a policy level, on a tech, well, hopefully if the tech firms cooperate more, but otherwise also on a security and intelligence level. Actually, my main focus at Oxford at the Violent Extremism Lab is trying to find ways, better ways of distinguishing credible threats from empty words that might also be violent, because the amount of threats of violence and announcements of violence on the internet is just is so hard to, it's so hard to assess what should actually be taken seriously, what should be investigated further, because the intelligence and security community also, of course, have limited resources. So I've done quite a bit of work with the intelligence and security agencies to help them also enhance and complement existing risk assessment frameworks. And we've done systematic linguistic analysis using, for example, LLMs. Oh, we're really running out. Using those to try and find better ways to linguistically spot patterns in people who then use violence.
Yes. Do you have anything quickly to add?
Yeah, quickly, I think we need to do a better job of setting up peer support networks for researchers who are working on similar things. Often people who understand your research area, understand the things that you're going through, can be the greatest sources of support. And I would say that professional associations, labs, universities can really do a lot to facilitate those types of peer networking opportunities.
And a good place to start would be the report that we get the QR code up again, just so people can see that again, where they can learn more. Really it is a project that's going to be transforming and ongoing, right? It doesn't just stop at these recommendations. So we want you all to take away what we've shared and start to think about ways in which you can support researchers. I will wrap it up there since we're out of time. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Super, thank you very much for this super important panel. Lena Frischlich, Digital Democracy Center, and we're also working on harassment against scientists. We did a rapid evidence assessment last year, but it's a German, so no one knows it. So I just want to underscore two things, and one of them is we're not the only ones under attack. A large study in Germany has just shown that researchers across disciplines are attacked. And the risk is nearly double as high as for the average population. And I think we need to talk about this as a systematic professional risk. We also need better psychological support at the universities. Often the psychological structures are not trained for that, neither are our ethical boards. And we definitely need better systematic funding outside of short-term grants, because a lot of the structures we have had in the US, for example, Rebecca's organization or so, they are very susceptible to political interference. So I just want to underscore, Alice, that we really need professional organizations, but also funding bodies to step in and to pay for example, psychological supervision directly in grant applications. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I mean, there's also technical responses like, making sure that universities can provide temporary phones for when people are traveling and teach them how to set it up, right? We shouldn't know this automatically, necessarily as researchers. There's a lot of different ways that universities are unprepared, and the response shouldn't be, well, don't do risky research, right? Thank you.
Hi, guys. I've got another microphone back here. Nina Jankowicz, thank you for this panel. I'll, of course, later talk about my personal story, but I want to tell a short story that has to do with Cambridge and then ask a question. I think, in particular, Alice, you might have some insight on this. So I did a piece of research with a PhD researcher here at Cambridge last fall that came out looking at attacks and harassment against the E-Safety Commissioner in Australia. And just to illustrate how these weaponized networks attacks have spread, the free speech activists of Australia then issued a Freedom of Information request to Cambridge to get emails that this PhD researcher had sent in relation to our research. This was something she did as a side hustle. It wasn't anything to do with her PhD here. And to their credit, Cambridge responded very well right away. This has now been appealed up to the Information Commissioner here in the United States. But this weaponized harassment is happening against younger scholars. And I think universities, as you said, Alice, really need to be prepared for it. So I'm wondering, for those that might be just thinking about this framework for the first time, and obviously they should read your report, what are the ways that universities in particular, scholars, younger scholars, can pre-brief their administrations about these threats? How can you explain it and kind of, no offense to administrators in the room, dumb it down a little bit, so that they understand what we're facing and what types of support folks might need, particularly on that kind of sticky legal front? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Nina. So in the report, we linked to two resources. One is from Rebecca Trumbull's Researcher Support Consortium, which was mentioned previously, and the other one is from UMass Amherst. And both of them have put together sort of information sheets that are targeted towards deans, department chairs, and things like that. What I would advise, if you live in a country that has FOIA laws, which is the US, the UK, Australia, and many others, go to your university's public records office and talk to them about how they deal with FOIA requests. We were able to do that at UNC and sort of get ahead of it so that when we did get FOIA'd, we sort of had a plan in place with the public records office of how to deal with it, because those things are really, really dependent on where you are, and in the US or what state you're in, what province you're in. It's very localized. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Alex Morzov, Vivo Partners. One quick thought. I did find a law firm in the US that is still not afraid. They specialize in defamation. In fact, they have one particular person who just works on defense from anti-vaxxers. So if any of you are interested, I'm happy to connect you to them. My question is around this deafening silence that we're experiencing now, perhaps as a result of these threats and the environment of fear in the US. There's not a lot of opposition, there's not a lot of criticism, not as much perhaps as we might expect. So for example, Marty Makary, our new head of the FDA, he published a book called Blind Spots, which I think is very dangerous. First of all, not because it's full of falsehoods, but because it undermines the whole medical establishment. But it has not been criticized in the main press and journals. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
The one thing I will say is the first 10 years of my career were spent at the BBC, where I was a news producer in news and current affairs. And when I first moved to the United States, I went to work at CNN, and I was absolutely shocked at the level I did not feel that the editorial standards in the United States lived up to what I had been trained in the UK, so there's that. And then in the US, you have the capitulation of whole networks where people that are journalists are actually standing down because of federal interference. So my short answer, again, I'm good at short answers, is that we're in a completely chilled environment. We haven't really spoken about media on this panel, but we don't have an independent media in the US, and I don't think people are really saying that. So to Gina's credit, and she said this in many venues I've been in, we're both British and we're both American, and what happens there could happen here. So definitely take what is being said here and implement so that you can seed the ground where we're not knocked over. Because in a free and open press, if that book had been released in the UK and then got into even Good Morning Britain, it probably would have been given an audience just because of the different media cultures. And I can speak about that more later.
I'd also just reinforce that this is also about legal threats, right? And researchers are also experiencing those as well as news organizations. So, you know, your ability to respond to legal threats as a researcher may well be very different if you have a higher profile. You might get pro bono help even if it's in the news, right? So you need the news to be reporting on what's happening with the researcher as well. So there is a cycle there of silence that tends to be perpetuated. And if the researchers under attack are not highlighted, then they may not also get legal support, right?
Hi. I just want to say thank you very much for doing this panel. This is an issue that I am very emotionally passionate about and I care a lot about. I do want to ask your perspective, or for you to comment on sort of what I view as the elephant in the room, which is that there have been coordinated online assaults on the reputation of academics for the last 4 years, primarily for objecting to a progressive ideology or criticizing DEI programs or refusing to align with DEI things. And I was very disappointed to see the lack of support that the universities provided or that their colleagues did. In fact, some of my colleagues who would say they supported academic freedom were perfectly gleeful at the idea of someone getting what they thought they deserved. And so I don't think there's any justification for the things we're seeing today. I'm horrified. But at the same time, I think if it becomes perceived that those protections are politicized, that they're only reserved for people of a particular persuasion, it becomes easier for people to then justify attacks as a sort of retribution.
I think that's very true. I would say also I've received attacks from left and right. Neither were fun. But yeah, I mean, it does need to be a response to, you know, regardless of where the attacker is coming from, right? We need to protect research.
And that goes directly to the don't pile on. It's not just don't pile on because you don't agree with them. It's don't pile on.
Yeah, when I was doing my research on online harassment, the people that I talked to had been harassed by people on the left, on the right, and from a large number of positions that did not map to political positions, like fandoms, for example. And if you accept that harassing people that you like is bad, then you have to also say that harassing people that you don't like is bad. Like, this is not the way that we should be dealing with conflicts. Like, we should not be morally policing people by sending angry online mobs with pitchforks after them. I strongly believe that. We need to take the normative out of these tactics and just say that the tactics should not be used against people regardless of whether we agree or disagree with them.
Yeah, Alexandra Geze from the European Parliament. First of all, thanks for this absolutely brilliant panel and this absolutely important topic. Especially for pointing out that these hate and harassment campaigns are very targeted against women and minority groups. The same thing happens not only in academia, but also in politics and journalism. It is very similar and is driving people out of the conversation. And this is not only in line with the ideology of the more right-wing groups where this started, it is also one of the reasons why I think the defense came in so late, because people, especially at the helm of those institutions, often don't feel enough solidarity to stand up for them. And this is true in politics, and I think it is true in academia. What I'm thinking is, I think we don't only need some kind of technical support. You said defend the defenders, and I totally subscribe to that. I think we also need to change the narrative, because what we are losing right now is the narrative. And the attack is this free speech absolutism, framing any kind of limitations to this as censorship. But what is actually happening, that it is the harassment and that the hate that is driving people to self-censor. You know, if I have to change my devices to travel, and I do that as well, to travel to the US, it hampers my ability to work during that time. If I have to double check everything, I'm not an academic, I'm a politician, if I have to check that 3 or 4 times and think a lot of times before I react on current affairs, everybody else of my colleagues has already spoken, and I don't have visibility. And then you described the more extreme cases of people losing everything. So the censorship effect, the chilling effect on free speech is enormous. And I think what we have to do is to move from the defensive on the offensive and say these attacks are attacks on free speech. And this is, I think, what we need to agree on and to defend for everybody, independent from their politics. Thank you.
I think we're out of time, right? Are we?
We're done.
Are we out of time?
There's one more. Can we?
So it's a pretty quick question. So much of like our research is prospective, right? We study things that we believe are like emerging in society. And I think that makes academics very susceptible to narratives that we are trying to craft an agenda, like we're trying to make things happen. So kind of to speak to your point, Alice, about how we communicate to the public, how do we communicate that, hey, you know, I'm studying transgender care deserts, not because I want to make transgenderism fetch, right? Not because I'm trying to like make this a thing, but because this is an emerging trend that I'm noticing that may have political implications for the future that we really need to be on top of right now, rather than after this problem has like really shown itself to be true, retrospectively studying it.
Yeah, I think it's about better communication with the public. And I'm not talking about just like op-eds. Whoever said yesterday that, you know, academics should start doing like, become better TikTok video, like that, I'm terrible at that kind of thing. Like I'm not trained at doing that, but maybe we can create partnerships or something. Like we're missing large swaths of the world because we're mostly talking to the institutional media and academic journals, right? We're just not able to get our frames out because they're so limiting. Yes. We have to be engaging more with popular media, and a lot of that is social media. Like many of us were super active on Twitter, but we have not been able to pivot to the more visual social media platforms because we're writers, right? Like I'm not gonna be like a content creator, influencer kind of person, but there is a way to get our messaging out through those platforms. I just don't think we've gotten to the point yet where we understand that it's really urgent that we get popular sentiment. Like somebody said yesterday, we have to start lobbying. Like we have to start building up public support for what we do. Like there's this really good narrative that academics are elitist and they're snotty and they steal money from the government and they don't care about you and they look down on everyone. And like, all right, like maybe some of that is a little bit true, but we should be countering that with all the wonderful positive things that academia does, that research brings to the world, right? And I don't think right now we're doing an effective job of that.
And the other thing I would say, just with my civil society hat on, some of our newest work, even though we're based in the US, I can't believe I had to say that, but bad times, y'all, like bad vibes. But one of the things that we're doing is to reclaim narratives around free speech. So for example, a colleague of ours, Marianne Franks, really writes about the fact that in the First Amendment in the United States is the right to criticize your government, which is actually under attack right now. It's not the right to go onto TikTok and tell somebody that they're fat and they're ugly and they shouldn't, you know, they don't deserve happiness. And it's amazing the number of research labs that we're in, specifically with social media companies, where they don't even understand the critiques. They're just like, well, it's free speech, so we can't moderate, or it's free speech, so, and we have to go back to them and say, no, you are a business with terms and conditions. Your serviceable market wants to be able to come onto this platform and dance, if that's what, if you're a TikToker or whatever they're doing on there. And this is impeding that, and we actually have to then be like, do you know who Elon Musk is? Do you know what happened to X when they got rid of moderation? And really make this business case. And I think that's the most exciting thing about this room, and certainly one of the talks earlier. This also, we have to make a market for better online hygiene and better protection of those of us that study the internet.
Yeah, and perhaps just a last comment building
Just a
on what
quick
you
one.
said. Yeah, just very quickly, but I also think it's such an important question, because I think as researchers, we shouldn't have to justify our choice of research questions or research fields. If we study climate change or gender issues or far-right extremism or male supremacy, I don't think we should have to justify ourselves. And I always compare it to doctors. Doctors never have to justify why they focus on a specific part of the body, why they focus on only the heart and not also the entire the rest of the body. I think we often are framed as our topics being inherently political, but they don't have to be. And I think and our research should speak for itself, that it's rigorous and it's not political as such.
That's a great point to end on. Thank you so much to my amazing panel.